It is true, as was earlier said, that I encouraged this event to go forward. And when I talked to Ted and Mary about it, they said, well, we should go forward, but you will have to talk about something in addition to the oceans because of all that has happened. And so what I thought I would do, I didn't bring a speech. This is the outline I made today to talk to you. And I may or may not use it. But I spent years and years and years on your behalf and by your leave studying about the present threats and the potential future threats to our security, trying to understand them and the people who present them, and how they fit into the larger pattern of life in the early 21st century. So what I would like to ask you to do is to think about the relationship of the endeavor we come here to celebrate tonight. A bunch of citizens trying to save the quality of our oceans and its rich biodiversity and its indispensable contribution to our very existence on this planet. To think about the relationship of that to what happened in New York and the Pentagon and in that sad field in Pennsylvania on September the 11th. Now, it's almost impossible to do, but I want you to imagine how you felt on September the 10th. And suppose this were occurring on September the 10th. If I had come here and I had asked you the question I'm about to ask you, what do you consider to be the dominant characteristic of life on Earth at the dawn of this new millennium? What would you have said on September the 10th? Let's just try some things. If you were basically an optimist, you might have said, well, the globalization of the economy and culture, enabling people from all over the world to do business with each other and generating more wealth than at any time in history. Or you might have said the explosion in information technology. When I took the oath of office as president in January of 1993, there were only 50 sites on the World Wide Web. 50. When I left office, there were over 350 million in 8 years. So you might say, if you understand the implications of all that, we'll soon have $7 trillion of global e-commerce per year, 4 or 5 years. There are now 30 times as many messages delivered by email as the Postal Service, or as some of the irreverent young people call it, snail mail. So you might say that's the dominant characteristic of this age. Or you might say that it is the explosion of democracy and diversity. For the first time in all history, more than half the people on this earth live under governments of their own choosing, just in the last few years. It has never happened before. And in most of the wealthy societies, things are growing far more diverse than ever before. Our most diverse school district has children from more than 180 different racial and ethnic groups. In the New York City schools alone, where I have been 3 times in the last 10 days, there are children from over 125 racial and ethnic groups in every conceivable religion in the world. And life is growing more interesting as well as more free. Or you might say that the dominant characteristic of the early 21st century will be the breathtaking advances in science. We'll find out what's in the black holes in outer space. We're still finding new life forms in the deepest rivers and at the bottom of the oceans. The sequencing of the human genome will enable us to identify the variants that cause most of the problems. We've already found the 2 genetic markers that make it more likely that women will get breast cancer. We're closing in on Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. The stem cell research gives us enormous potential there. The combination of biomedical research and something called nanotechnology, which is nothing more than super micro technology, raises the specter that we will be able to identify cancerous tumors when they're just a few cells in size, totally unidentifiable now by any known diagnostic technique, thus rendering the whole idea of a metastasized incurable cancer a relic of the past. Scientists are working on digital chips to replicate the nerve functioning of damaged nerves in the spine, raising the specter that, like a heart pacemaker, we might actually have a digital chip we can put in the backs of people with damaged spines, enabling them to get up and walk again. And these things are not fanciful. It's just a question of when they will occur. So if you feel really hopeful about the world, or you did on September 10th, you might say, well, any of these things. The globalization of the economy and culture. Hollywood knows about that. I was talking to somebody today that made more money in Japan than in America on a movie he made. You might say the sweep of democracy and diversity. You might say the explosion of information technology. You might say these breathtaking scientific advances. I'll just give you one other example. The women in this room of childbearing age, or with your childbearing years ahead of you, will soon be able to come home with your babies from the hospital and have a little gene card that will tell you all the potential problems and the basic strengths of your children. And if you do the following 20 things, you will dramatically increase your child's life expectancy. And when that happens, we will be seeing the young women in this room will be giving birth to children that have a life expectancy in excess of 90 years. Now, so that is the pretty picture you might paint of the future. Now, if you are your family's designated worrier, as my senator from New York refers to herself as our family's designated worrier, even on September 10th, you might have said, no, well, this is all very fine, this is things that are happening, but think of what is likely to be the dominant characteristic of this time. Instead, it's our common threats we face. The threats to the environment, climate change, the water shortage, which threatens to drastically disrupt food production. And there are already 1.5 billion people on the globe, 1 in 4 who never get a clean glass of water. Or you might say the deterioration of the oceans, because if we permit more big dead spaces like the one that exists at the end of the Gulf of Mexico off the coast of Louisiana to occur, we are at risk of changing the whole biodiversity of the planet, which is why I did so many of the things by executive orders that are listed in the program. And climate change, of course, is the largest of all, because if we just learned that this last summer was the 5th hottest since 1895, 9 of the 11 hottest years recorded since 1400 have occurred in the last 10 years, in the last 12 years. If the Earth continues to warm for the next 50 years at the rate it's warmed at the last 10, we will lose 50 feet of Manhattan Island. We will lose the Florida Everglades I worked so hard to restore, and the cane fields of Louisiana, and certain Pacific Island nations will be flooded. We will create millions upon millions of food refugees in the world as agricultural patterns are disrupted. And unless we do something to turn it around, we will pay a grievous price. So you might say you're worried about the environmental challenges, and they'll be the dominant characteristic of the early part of the millennium. Or you might say, no, as bad as that is, if we don't do something about the breakdown of public health systems and the coming of the AIDS epidemic, we will have the equivalent of the plague in the 14th century, when the bubonic plague killed 1 in 4 people in Europe. Except it's global now. Today, 36 million people have AIDS. 70% of them are in Africa. But the fastest growing rates of AIDS are in the former Soviet Union, on Europe's back door, in the Caribbean, on America's front door, in India, the biggest democracy in the world, and the Chinese government just admitted they've got an epidemic on their hands with twice as many cases as they had previously thought, and regrettably only 4% of the adults in China know how AIDS is contracted and spread. So you can say, this really bothers me. We could have a real problem on our hands here. Or you could say, you think globalization is not one of the great positives of the 21st century, it's one of the great negatives. Like all those protesters in Naples and every place, Genoa and Seattle. I think they're wrong, by the way. They're demonstrably wrong that globalized economy caused the misery of the world. The poor countries that have chosen to trade and be open have grown twice as fast as the poor countries that are closed, and more people have been lifted out of poverty in the last 30 years than at any time in human history. But the protesters are right that this deal is not helping half the world. Half the world, you think about this next time you buy a cup of coffee, half the people live on less than $2 a day. 1 billion people live on less than $1 a day. 1 billion people go to bed hungry every night. 1.5 billion people never get a clean glass of water. A woman dies every minute in childbirth. And 1 in 4 of all the people who will die this year, including from heart attacks, strokes, cancer, accidents, terrorists, everything else, 1 in 4 of all the deaths on earth will come from AIDS, TB, malaria, and diarrhea, mostly little kids who never got a clean glass of water. So you could say the poverty of the world and the fact that the global economy leaves half the people out, and the fact that we're going to have a 50% increase in population on the earth in the next 50 years, all of it in the poor countries unable to sustain it, is the biggest fact. Or if you really thought about it a lot, even on September 10th, you might have said that the dominant characteristic of the early part of this century will be the combustible mix of terrorism and racial or religious or ethnic or tribal hatred. Now, here's what I want to ask you. What do all the negative things and all the positive things have in common? This is what you have to know to understand what is happening to us. They all have in common what I think is the dominant characteristic of the early 21st century, which is the breathtaking increase in our interdependence. Distance and walls are collapsing all around us. And it's been a great ride for America. The movie industry is more globalized than ever before. The entertainment industry generally more globalized than ever before. The economy more globalized than ever before. Then internally, we're more globalized than ever before as we grow more and more diverse. And it is a lot more interesting to be an American now than it was 30 years ago. It's been a great ride. But climate change is also globalized. We are the biggest offenders today on greenhouse gas emissions, but people half a world away will suffer from our offenses just as much as we will. And if we don't set a good example and do something, in 30 years from now, the Chinese and the Indians will be emitting more greenhouse gases than we are. They will be the biggest offenders, but we will suffer just as much as their people do in this interdependent world. The same thing is true of AIDS. It is not an African problem. It's a global problem for the reasons I stated earlier. And the same thing is true of world poverty. For if half the world, and increasingly maybe more than half, given population growth, is outside the circle of positive interdependence, it will both limit our long-term economic growth and prospects and increase the pool from which the terrorists recruit. And so I say to you, and why do you think the whole world rallied to our cause here? Because they could all see themselves in the World Trade Center. And indeed, in large measure, they were here. People from over 60 countries lost their lives in America on September the 11th. So all the good and all the bad reflect the two sides of the collapse of walls and distance and the increasing growth of complex patterns of interdependence. Therefore, all the great questions of the 21st century basically boil down to, is this a good thing or not for most people? And what I would like to say to all of you is that obviously the worst negative example you could ever imagine of interdependence as a bad thing, the collapse of distance and walls, is what happened to over 6,000 human beings on September the 11th. But if you make common cause with people around the world to save the oceans, you'll save a lot of lives over the next 50 years. And you can only do it if other people help you. We can no more save the oceans by ourselves than we can raise or lower its level alone. But if we do our part and others do it, we can. So what I would like to ask you to do, when you try to think about what happened to you, you have to think about what is it we should do to maximize our positive interdependence and minimize our negative interdependence. And then to me, even more importantly, how should we think about it? And you know, just to be repetitive, America's got to take the lead on climate change, because if we don't, no one will follow. Today, America has to take the lead in supporting the Secretary General of the UN in setting up his International Trust Fund for AIDS, TB, and malaria, because if we don't, others won't do it. And we'll either pay now or pay later. Because I assure you, if we go from 36 million to 100 million AIDS cases, you will see a dramatic disruption in the political life of many countries. You will see democracies destabilized. You will see more fighting and war and misery, and more young people with nothing to lose because they think they're going to die anyway. But if we put this fund together and we do more on prevention, we do more on treatment, we get those drugs out there that they're now going to be able to get at affordable rates, we can absolutely turn the AIDS epidemic around. There's no reason in the wide world we should have 100 million AIDS cases in 5 years. Brazil cut the death rate in half and the hospitalization rate by 80% in 3 years. And we can do it everywhere. Same thing is true with climate change. It is not necessary to put more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to grow the economy. For poor countries to grow rich, for rich countries to stay rich and get richer. It is no longer true. And it's important. The poverty challenge is basically about education and economic growth. There's 100 million kids in this world today, under 12, who are not in school at all. And in the poor countries of the world, every year of schooling adds 10 to 20% a year to income. We can send them to school. Last year we got $300 million from the Agriculture Department to offer school children in the poorest countries in the world a nutritious meal every day. 9 million of them with $300 million for a whole year, but only if they come to school to get the meal. It's a lot of money, but it's peanuts compared to letting them all grow up ignorant, angry, and vulnerable to the claims of the terrorists. Huge, breathtaking, raucous, wonderful, happy coalition to relieve the debt of the poorest nations in the world that included everybody from the Pope to Pat Robertson, Bono to Jesse Helms. That was amazing. And it worked. And we basically said, okay, we'll get rid of your debt if you put all the money into education, health care, or economic development. And you got to be able to prove that's where you put it. And Uganda, in 1 year, doubled their primary school enrollment and lowered their class sizes. It's a big deal. I could give you I could give you 23 other examples. But these things are important. When it comes to terror, even though we have terrible problems in the world of poverty and people left outside the circle of opportunity, nothing can justify the deliberate taking of innocent civilian life for political purposes. But it is a fact of modern life, and it has been around a long, long time. And let me just say, if you look at the whole history of terrorism, no strategy of terror alone has ever defeated any country in human history, and it certainly will not defeat the greatest country in human history. But it can do a lot of damage in a world where we are more interdependent than ever before, where we have these complex, almost unimaginably numerous webs of interdependence, because they shatter networks of confidence and community. And so we have to have the best defense we can. The first thing you need to know is that there are hundreds and hundreds of people who work all the time to try to protect you from what happened on September the 11th. And they're still working, and they'll get better at it. In the millennium alone, over a dozen planned terrorist attacks were thwarted, including one bombing in the Northeast, one in the Northwest, a plan to put a bomb at the Los Angeles airport, a plan to bomb the biggest hotel in Amman, Jordan, a plan to bomb one of the Christian holy sites in the Holy Land, and several others. Earlier, there was a plan to bomb Holland Tunnel, a plan to blow up airplanes flying to the Philippines from the West Coast, and several others. And believe you me, nobody feels worse about what happened than the people who thwarted all those other attacks and wonder why they didn't make it this time. So our airline safety will get better. Our ability to track people when they're in the country and use computer technology will get better. Our defenses will get better. And our offenses will get better. But there are a lot of people who work on that too. The people who bombed the World Trade Center the first time are in jail. The people who did the murders outside the CIA building are in jail. Timothy McVeigh was convicted for Oklahoma City. Mr. bin Laden was indicted after the African embassies were blown up, but a lot of his cells were taken down in Europe. And they'll get better. So we'll play better offense and we'll play better defense. And now we have people all over the world who never helped us do anything before wanting to help us because they recognize the interdependence. And they want to be on our side because they know our side is their side. Now, but here's what I want to tell you about this. I think the most important thing is that you understand not every little detail about what our anti-terror policy is, or even any of these other details. You have to understand that the contest in which we are now engaged fundamentally is about what the 21st century is going to be like for our kids. It's about the nature of truth, the nature of human life, and the nature of the human community. I spent a lot of time thinking about Mr. bin Laden and his crowd. He believes that the truth is something he has. It is a particularly narrow and intense definition of Islamic truth. he believes that human life is to be respected if it accepts his truth. But if you're a Muslim and you don't accept his truth, then you're a heretic. And if you die, good for you. And if you're not a Muslim, well, you're an infidel, and it doesn't matter if you die, even if you were a 6-year-old girl who decided to go to work with her mother at the World Trade Center on September the 11th. You don't count. He believes the community is a community of true believers, like the Taliban. And I don't know how many of you have seen the excerpts from the movie Behind the Veil, which has been showing on some of the television, but you get an idea of what their idea of community is. All those poor women wearing those burqas and these sanctimonious men beating them with sticks on the street, and one of them even getting shot. That's their idea of heaven on earth. It's a pretty dreary future, which may be why people are still trying to get out of there and get into here. But you have to understand, you look at this man's eyes, you're not looking at Charles Manson or Timothy McVeigh. This man is a worthy adversary who believes this. And all over the world there are people who are perfectly happy to use modern technology, use the internet, use modern weaponry, use modern airplanes, use money transactions, make sophisticated investments on Wall Street. But they have very primitive ideas in the sense that they think they have the truth. They think they know who counts and who doesn't in life, and they think a community is just people who are just like them. And on the other side, you have sort of the accumulated history of this country and many others in the world. God knows there are things that have happened in Western civilization we can't be proud of. There were times in the Crusades when the Christians slaughtered both Muslims and Jews who were innocent non-combatants. There were times when the Ku Klux Klan killed people who were innocent non-combatants. There were plenty of times when we did not live up to our creed, but at least we had the right creed. So for quite a long while now, America has been stumbling along in the right direction. And why have we made it as a free people? Because, let's go back to the beginning. We believe that the nature of truth is nobody has it except God. No one has it all. We believe that the nature of life is that it is a journey where you move toward truth and never fully attain it. And therefore, we believe we are required to respect the journeys of others and the prospect that even our staunchest adversaries may be right about something. We might be wrong about something. And therefore, all those who follow a certain set of rules and the law and respect each other, whatever their race or their gender or their sexual orientation or their religion, they can still be part of our community. And we also understand that a lot of growing up in life is learning to get beyond the categories by which we have defined ourselves and our crowd, and a constant reaching out to deepen our understanding of what the human community is. You know, I always tell people that they shouldn't assume that this has ever been easy. People who have tried to get us to leave our group hatreds and identities behind and embrace our common humanity have always been at risk. And in my lifetime, think about what has happened to the greatest human spirits who called us to be peacemakers. Gandhi was killed by one of his own, a radical Hindu, because he wanted India for Muslims and Jains and Sikhs and others as well, and Christians. The only two political leaders to be murdered in the Middle East were Anwar Sadat and my great friend Yitzhak Rabin. Sadat killed by one of his own, who couldn't forgive him for reaching across the divide to make peace. And Yitzhak killed by one of his own, who couldn't forgive him for reaching across the divide to make peace. The only great soul to survive this slaughter was Mandela, whose people did forgive him for reaching across the divide to make peace, perhaps because he had already paid with 27 years of his life behind bars. When I was a young college student and we were studying Western civilization, there was a medieval myth we used to study. I hadn't thought about it in years and years until this awful days. It was the story of Parzival, who was a rather interesting fellow who made all these trips and had all these adventures. But the subtitle of the myth of Parzival is Parzival, the Good Man, Slowly Wise. That pretty much sums up what most of us think. Yes, some people do bad things, and sometimes there's evil in the world, but most people are basically good. No one has the truth. They can become slowly wise on life's journey. And part of increasing wisdom is increasing our idea of who is in our community. I saw them when I went to the family center, and I saw all these people holding these little flyers with the pictures of their family members and coming up to me saying, President Clinton, here is my mother, here is my father, my husband, my wife, my fiance, my brother, my sister. And you look at these pictures on these little flyers. This is the floor they were on. This is how old they were. You know, this is how much they weighed. This is how tall they were. If you find them, please let me know. These were the people Mr. bin Laden thought did not count or deserve to live and should be treated as combatants because they do not embrace truth. Now, the great Catholic chaplain of the fire department. I was in a fire station last week, and there's a little boy that was there the last time I was there, and he was 8 years old, had army fatigues on, and he had fatigues on the last time I was there. The little fire station lost 10 people in Midtown Manhattan. 10, this little bitty station. And the boy's father is a fireman who's just fine. I said, did your son love those fatigues? He said, no, he doesn't love those fatigues. He was wearing them on the day my brother, his uncle, disappeared. And he's going to wear them until he knows for sure what happened to him. At Rosh Hashanah services in our temple in Chappaqua, I met one of the two men who carried a disabled woman down 84 flights of stairs to safety. Walking in my park, I met a woman whose husband was lost as a firefighter and her 4 sisters-in-law. First day I was down there, I was talking to all the victims, and I met this huge guy who had tears in his eyes, and he looked at me and he said, I am an Egyptian Muslim American. And you may find this hard to believe, but I hate those people worse than you do. And I'm so afraid my countrymen will never trust me again. These are the stories of people who are not in the Taliban's or Mr. bin Laden's definition of community, who do not deserve to live because they do not have the truth. They can use our tools, but they could not make them. They can tear at the entrails of our society, but they could never replicate it. They can twist the faith of Islam, but they cannot make their twisting true. I know you all want to understand every little thing about every little detail of airline safety and all that. I rode 3 airplanes last week. It's the safest place to be in America, except in your own homes on an airplane right now. what I want to tell you is, this country's going to be fine. I can't tell you there'll never be another terrorist attack. I can't tell you somebody you love will never be hurt. I can tell you this, in all of human history, terrorism has never prevailed as a strategy. And it will not prevail now unless they succeed in their larger aims, not just getting America out of the Middle East, but getting America out of its own sense of itself, making us turn against one another because we no longer trust our Islamic or our non-Islamic Arab brothers and sisters, beating up on Sikhs because they look like the Taliban. I mean, both sides wear turbans. All these things that have happened. Or unless they kill our self-confidence. We don't want to fly on airplanes. We don't want to invest in the stock market. We don't want to come to the Oceans dinner. In other words, they cannot win unless we give them permission. And when you understand that this is a battle for the nature of truth, the nature of human life, the nature of the human community, and that if we make it come out all right on those old-fashioned basic questions, then the economics, the technology revolution, the scientific revolution, the spread of democracy and diversity, they will make this age the most prosperous, peaceful, exciting time the world has ever known. Our children and our grandchildren will have longer and better lives. But there will never be a time, unless we can change human nature, when we won't be somewhat vulnerable to the organized forces of destruction. So when you go home tonight, hug your kids and your grandchildren. Think about all those firemen and policemen who died. I got to say one last thing about the fire department. Like a medieval army. The general goes first. And it was an awesome thing to watch. They gave up their lives to save lives. The terrorists were not cowards, but were mad. They gave up their lives to take lives. And in that contrast is the difference between our ideas of truth, the value of life, and the nature of our human community. We have got to make sure that we're right on those three things. If we win that, the rest of it's a cakewalk. And from what I've seen on the streets of New York, we will. Don't lose heart. Just go on and save the oceans while you're at it. Thank you.